Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of November of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we got a lot of very interesting geolocations, and when I summarized everything, I came to the conclusion that most likely the Russians began very dangerous and very interesting maneuver against the armed forces of Ukraine. So let's discuss in details, and first we're going to talk about the most western part of Shakhtarsk, where the Russians raised their flag, which confirms complete control over the settlement by the armed forces of Russian Federation. You know that the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported about complete control over the settlement several days ago, but without any geolocations to confirm control with the western part. And just today, on the 4th of November, we got the complete 100% evidence. So, but this video was from Shakhtarsk is not the most important. Of course, the village is very important, the base as a base for further advances. First, let's discuss the updates that were published today by different mappers. For example, neutral mappers are saying that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the western direction along 0510 road. So this is the progress that was confirmed and reported by neutral mappers. As for pro-Ukrainian sources like Deep State, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly between the villages of Shakhtarsk itself and the village of Yasna Polyana. As for these two directions, we have no questions, because we understand the Russians need to maintain the line of combat contact, they need to increase the area of control around the settlements, and many other things that should be completed before moving further. But for example, pro-Russian resources published today a very interesting map that shows us very interesting progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. And according to pro-Russian resources, as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the northwestern direction from the village of Yasna Polyana and to reach these lines. Very important advance, and now let's discuss this in details. For example, now we see that the Russians changed their direction. First, we were thinking and we thought that most likely the Russians are going to attack in the northern direction towards the village of Rozliv, and after that toward the village of Konstantinopol, with the purpose to cut the city of Kurakhove off from supply and to create a cauldron. But obviously these let's say advances in the northern direction are too long, and obviously it will take time. So that's why I believe that the Russians changed their plans, so they have different plans from the beginning, and now we see that the Russians are moving in the northwestern direction, and most likely the Russians are going or planning to reach this line. So summarizing everything, most likely the Russians have the next task for the next several weeks to get these lines, and if the Russians are able to reach this red line from the northwestern direction, let's say in this point, then from these positions the Russians will be able to cut completely the supply road that goes from the village of Bogatyr in the southern directions towards the village of Razdolny, and further in the southwestern direction towards the village of Velika Novoselovka. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours we got a very interesting video from the village of Razdolny, and in this video we can see how the Russian forces were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the settlement with the use of FABs of different calibers. So everything, the progress on the ground in the northwestern direction, the significant number of FABs that were used on the village of Razdolny give us the understanding that most likely the Russians are going to move exactly in this direction. But the question is, what is the purpose of this attack if Velika Novoselovka still has a lot of roads for supply and support? And to answer this question, we need to go to the Zaporizhzhia direction, to the city of Gulyai-Polye, where we have another statement, another post that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, very reliable pro-Ukrainian sources, and they're saying that the Russians are about or concentrating the significant number of forces in the Zaporizhzhia direction. But in the second part of the post, the author of this article added that the Russians are concentrating their forces not around the village of Rabotino or Orekhovo. The Russians are concentrating their forces in the Gulyai-Polye area. So this is the city of Gulyai-Polye, and the Russians are concentrating their forces somewhere here. And as for this direction, during the months of October, we got the significant number of updates exactly from the area between the villages of Stepove, Livadne and Priyutne. If you remember, during since the beginning of October, the Russians conducted several attacks in the northern direction. We got lots of posts, lots of articles from pro-Ukrainian mappers, from neutral mappers, from pro-Russian mappers of the Russian advances in this direction, that the Russians managed to take under control the significant number of territories, and we have all these changes on the ground. Yes, of course, as for now, we have them as a contested area, but the most important part is that we got reports about the Russian activity exactly in this direction. So now, if we summarize everything that we received from the area of Razdolny, Novoukrainka, Shakhtarskaya, Yasnaya Polyana, and if we summarize recent Russian activity to the north of Priyutina, we can make a conclusion that most likely during the next few weeks the Russians are about to launch the Zaporizhzhia direction, but most likely not in the direction of Gulay Polye or not in the direction of Orekhov, but most likely the Russians are planning to move in the direction of 0510 road in the northern direction from the settlements of Priyutina and Livadne. And if the Russians, as a result of this offensive, are able to take under control these few villages, this is not so many, a big number of villages, just 5 villages like Timirovka, Zeleno Polye, Novosilka, Novopol, Novodarivka, Rivnopol, just 6 villages. If the Russians are able to take them under control, first of all, the Russians would be able to cut this road, and basically the Russians would be able to create the cauldron, another encirclement for the armored forces of Ukraine that are currently located in the village of Velika Novoselovka. So I believe this is exactly what we can see right now. And this operation, first of all, depends on the Russian success in the direction of the village by the name of Razdolny. So the next 2-3 days are very important. If we continue receiving updates exactly in this direction, that most likely this is exactly what the Russians are planning to conduct during the next, by the end even of this year, because this is not very difficult operation regarding the, let's say, taking into account Russian speed and the level of Russian maneuvers and so on. We can make a conclusion that these 2 footholds around Velika Novoselovka, the Russians are able to take under control within the next 2-3 weeks. Everything depends on the resources and number of forces the Russians have in this direction. Now let's move further and let's talk about the original Kurakhove direction, where the Russians also continue advancing. Maximovka, nobody has any doubts whether the Russians establish control over the settlement or not, because today the Russian sources published the video with the flag in the central part of the settlement. Yet the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation haven't provided us this information. But anyway, we see that the Russians are moving. Now let's talk about the village of Bogoyavlenka. We have some doubts and some questions about this direction, because as for different mappers, just today we got report that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the northern direction from the settlement. The Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit along this tree line, and the Russians captured the tree line to the northeast of the settlement itself. But as for different pro-Russian resources, most of them are saying that the village of Trudovo was already captured by the Russians by the end of the 4th of November. Some other pro-Russian resources reported that currently there are very heavy clashes for the company stronghold between the village of Konstantinopolskaya and Uspenovka itself. So very difficult to understand what exactly is happening here right now. One thing we can say for sure, that the Russians are moving further in the northern direction. Of course, we are waiting for additional geolocations, additional updates, and most likely we are going to receive them during the next few days. Now let's move further and let's talk about the area of responsibilities of the group of forces south. We got lots of geolocations and we have some changes on the ground. First, we got the photo that was published by the 79th Air Mobile Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine of destroyed Russian personnel carrier on the territory of the bridge. So most likely the Russians were trying to attack, were trying to break through the Ukraine defense belt, but the Russian vehicle was destroyed exactly in this area, which slowed down the Russians, and furthermore the photo was made by the Ukrainians. So somewhere along this road, the Ukrainian soldiers were making the photo of the destroyed Russian vehicle, which means that the Russians haven't managed to break through the defense belt, and now the Russians still on the territory of Katerinovka. As for the village of Antonovka, since the beginning of November, we got the significant number of videos of how the Russians were moving on the territory of this settlement. But as for the previous days, we were receiving a lot of videos of how the Russian infantry was working on the territory of the settlement. This is the first video, and this is the second video of the second episode of the same video, just Russian infantry. But today, on the 1st of November, we got another video that was published also by pro-Russian sources, and in this video we can see the work of Russian vehicles. So in this video we can see that the Russian vehicles, carriers, infantry carriers were moving further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to reach the central part or even the northwestern part of the village of Antonovka. This episode of heavy activities was geolocated here, but obviously the Russian vehicles were moving further. So most likely the map that you can see right now in front of your screen doesn't have anything with reality. I believe that the Russian edge positions is already going somewhere along this red line. So something like this currently is happening here. Now let's move further and let's talk about the village of Dalnya. We've been talking a lot about possible Russian outflanking operation, and today we got more videos and more updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions exactly on the way of possible outflanking maneuver, and another temporary deployment point of the armed forces of Ukraine was destroyed as a result of counter-artillery duels. If we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of months, we can see that there is some activities exactly along this line. Now let's talk about the area of responsibilities of the Group of Forces Center, and as for the 4th of November, we see that the Russians reduced their activities on the line between Kremenная Balkanova, Selidovka and Vovchenka completely. During the previous 24 hours, we got just one post, just one article published by neutral mappers about Russian control over the most western part of Vovchenka. So this is just the only change of the map during the previous 24 hours, which is very important. The Russians either are regrouping, or maybe the Russians managed to advance even further, but we still haven't received anything to confirm this. Anyway, as for different pro-Russian sources, they are saying that currently there are very heavy clashes for the village of Vilinka and that Ukrainians are retreating. Furthermore, we continue receiving reports about the clashes on the outskirts of Berestki. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. Now we are moving to the city of Selidove, and we see that the Russians resumed their offensive operation in the western direction. We've been talking a lot about this territory, and the most important thing that we were discussing is the significant number of FPV drone attacks along the main supply roads that goes between the villages of Petrikovka, Vishneva, Yurivka, Toretsk, and further in the northern direction towards the city of Pokrovsk. Lots of episodes. Just for the previous 24 hours, we got up to 5 videos of how the Russians were hunting and destroying the Ukrainian vehicles that were moving along this road, which means the complete focus of the armed forces of Russian Federation, the highest priority for this direction for the armed forces of Russian Federation, and that something big is about to happen here very, very soon. And you know, we didn't need to wait for a very long period of time, because today we got the first video from the settlement of Alexandrovka. The Russian sources published the video of how they were attacking this settlement from the east in the western direction. This is a very long video, more than 1 minute, and in this video, during the video, we can see a lot of Russian vehicles, tanks, infantry carriers. We can see a lot of Russian soldiers moving through the fields. We can see several Ukrainian soldiers that surrendered and were captured by the Russians. And in the final part of the video, we can see the Russian convoy entering the village. And in the most edge moment of the video, we can see the Russian flag raised in the village. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Just yesterday, the Russians were controlling the tree lines in the western part, and today we got a report that the Russians entered and managed to dig in deeper. This video was published probably 10 or even more hours ago, and most likely during the previous day, the Russians managed to improve their positions even further in the western direction. And as for this territory, we understand that the primary goal, the primary task for the Russians is to reach this line and to take as many as possible settlements under control. If the Russians are able to advance so far in the western direction and to force the Ukrainians to fall back to the village of Pushkina, then the Russians will create a significant risk for the Ukrainians from the north in the southern direction. So from these positions, the Russians will be able to attack in the southern direction and to defeat the Ukrainians along this dense network of the fortifications. This is the strategical point, the strategical line of defense of the armored forces of Ukraine, and this is the vital and question for the Russians to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory. If the Russians can do this, then they will be able to get even a little bit closer to the end of the South Donetsk battle. Now let's move further and let's talk about the city of Toretsk. During the previous 24 hours, we got several updates exactly from this territory. We start adjusting the map back in Russian favor. I'll remind you that during the months of October, we were adjusting the map just in Ukraine favor based on the videos and report of different mappers. But starting from November, the Russians regrouped and began counteroffensive once again. And as you can see, this is the dynamic for the previous 2 days. So this is the situation on the 2nd of November. And this is the situation on the 4th of November. The Russians are moving, and most likely we are going to continue receiving updates from this territory. As for the Chasiv Yar, the Sivers direction, nothing special. Now we are moving to the south in Kupyansk direction, and there are very heavy clashes. The Russians are moving further in the south. According to information we have, the Russians managed to repel several Ukrainian counterattacks in the village of Terny, and most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation either will confirm Russian control over the settlement, or we're going to receive report from different soldiers on the ground with Russian flags in the central part of the settlement. So the Russians are advancing. As for the village of Tarskoye, there are very heavy clashes. For now, nobody, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, are able to get the initiative in their hands. As for the northern Kupyansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got just small changes on the ground. Basically, we turned the contested area into the Russian favor based on the video that was published by the Ukrainians. In this video, we can see Ukrainians that were actively drawing the Russians along these 3 lines. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kursk direction, because in the Kursk direction, we see that something big is happening right now or about to happen. First of all, I would like to discuss with you the video that was published from the village of Kanitsa. In this video, we can see how the Russian reconnaissance drone was flying above another Ukrainian military base in this area, and the Russian drone managed to discover the significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, infantry carriers, and just light vehicles, a lot Bradley. In this, for example, episode, the next episode, we can see up to 3 Bradley fighting vehicles in the same place. And when the Russians managed to collect as many as possible information, they began bombing and attacking this territory with the Iskander missile. As a result of this attack, the Ukrainians lost a significant number of forces, up to 10 armored combat vehicles, 3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 2 tanks, 2 Gvozdika howitzers, 1 air defense system, 10 transport, just regular vehicles, and up to 60 soldiers. The significant losses, and telling the truth, this is not the first case since the beginning of November that we received about the use of Russian Iskander missiles. I'll remind you that just several days ago we got video from the settlement of Donetsk in the let's say Sivers direction. This is the settlement, and we also got the video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory with a significant number of Iskander missiles. With the same video, and as for this case, the Russians are saying that they attacked the temporary deployment point of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. There were 4 Iskander strikes in the same place. Also, a big camp, big temporary deployment point was destroyed. And I'll remind you that right after this attack, the Russians resumed their offensive operation in the direction of Ivano-Darivka and Vyimka in the Siversk area, and the Russians were fighting with the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. So these attacks, these 4 Iskander missiles in the area of Sumy means that most likely the Russians are about to begin another wave of the full-scale offensive operation in the Kursk direction, with the purpose to get get additional square kilometers in Russian favor and to restore control over several settlements like most likely Pogrebki, Orlovka, Staraya Sorochna, so the settlements in the northwestern part of the Sudzha salient. As for geolocations on the ground, we have one video of one Russian attack that took place in the southeastern part, and in this video we can see Russian vehicles, Russian tanks that were attacking the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians. There was just one vehicle with infantry on board. Anyway, the Russians managed to improve their positions. The Russians were attacking somewhere here. So we see, and I believe we can start counting even hours before the beginning of the third wave of the Kursk counter-offensive operation. The Ukrainians managed to brought a lot of forces in this area, trying to not allow the Russians to break through the defenses. So most likely the next few days are going to be very hot and very interesting. And that's it for today. Military Summary Channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.